Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our roadmap for right living, which is based on the book of Swami Kriyananda's, which is now called Affirmations for Self-Healing. I held this book up yesterday, which nobody would ever know anything about. It's the first edition, 1987, of this book, but the contents are exactly the same. It's the 52 qualities that Swamiji put together with affirmations and prayers for each one as are part of our Sunday morning service. But I'm not working so much with the affirmations as I'm working with the wonderful, succinct instructions for right living that are included in Swami's description of each of these 52 qualities. So I had anticipated that I would be able to do one quality in one day, but I think that was naive. So we are 3 lines into success, and we will continue today, and we'll just take as long as we want. That's the fun of it. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Parmhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel the wisdom and the joy of your presence within us. Lift us above all lesser considerations, that we may live our life in constant attunement with your infinite love. Om, peace. Amen. So, quality number 1 in Swami's wonderful book, Success. Yesterday there are 3 paragraphs generally in each one of these, 2 or 3 paragraphs. And success has 3 paragraphs. We dealt with number 1, which said, true success means transcendence. It means finding what we really want, which is not outward things, but inner peace of mind, self-understanding, and above all, the joy of God. And it was those 3 qualities that we talked about in our first session. So now he has a very interesting point of view. Outward success means transcendence also, because the first paragraph was dealing with how success would be defined if we were thinking of inner states of consciousness. So true success means transcending all limitations. And then he says, now outward success means transcendence also, which of course is a very interesting statement, because we tend to think of transcendence as something having to do with our inner awareness. So because, he says, it means rising above past accomplishments to reach new levels of achievement. Isn't that, I just love the way Swami can take very subtle ideas that you think of have primarily a spiritual dimension to them, and then he can express them on all levels. When Swami talked about Master's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which Master himself said was would bring millions of people to God, which was an interpretation of the Gita that had never been offered before. And one of the ways that he described the uniqueness about the interpretation he offered was that it applied the Gita to all levels of life, not just the spiritual, but also the practical everyday side of how to live in this world. And that's what I'm also working with. I'm not likening myself to Master's Gita commentary, but by calling this a roadmap for right living, we're taking high spiritual ideals and showing how they relate to every level. And this is more than just, oh, isn't this clever that we can do this? This is actually a fundamental characteristic of the ascending age of Dwapara, which we were now entering into, and also a fundamental characteristic of Master's mission in its entirety. Because the characteristic of the age that we have recently exited from, the Yuga that we have recently exited from, this is the ancient tradition of ascending and descending ages, and each age has a relationship, the degree to which life is defined by the limitations of matter and the degree to which it's expressed by the expansive awareness of spirit. So the age that we have just exited from in the year 1900 was the transition, Kali Yuga, was the age of matter. And in the age of matter, everything has strict form. And just as material things cannot be combined, this book and my hands are separate, and I can squeeze the book as hard as I want, but it still remains separate. And so religions become separate, languages become separate, cultures, races, everything. If you're born into a certain social position, you will die in that social position. You will never be able to shift. And that was the way society ran. There were the serfs, there were the kings, there was the soldiers, there was the aristocrats, there were the outcasts, whatever it was, and it was fixed. The age of Dwapara is the age of energy. And of course, science and all fields keep up with the rising age. So now we have the revelation that Einstein offered us, that matter is only a vibration of energy. Now, of course, sages throughout whatever yuga it is always see the full truth. And so the tradition of India, the Vedanta tradition of India and of the yogis, they've always known it was only energy. In fact, they know it's thought and consciousness. So the truth never goes away. It's more like the basic level of civilization rises and falls on the planet. This is a planetary phenomenon. People still evolve as they evolve. You do not automatically evolve by just holding on to the planet. You can't just hold on to Earth and insist on staying here and evolve with it. Your physical body will die and you'll be incarnated on the planet that is at the suitable stage of enlightenment for what you yourself need at that particular point. So Master came, this whole line of gurus came, and Master came to the West to help establish a teaching that would usher in the Dwapara Yuga age. America is a Dwapara Yuga country because we have, from the beginning, we abolished, in principle, in fact, it's taking us time to catch up to it, but in principle, we have abolished all of the social rigidity which had been the absolute norm during Kali Yuga. Now, America started during the transition time, which was 1700 to 1900. This was the transition time between Kali and Dwapara. So the far-thinking American revolutionaries could see that they were building a country for a time that wasn't quite with us. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, endowed by their Creator with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There couldn't be a more Dwapara Yuga statement. Now, don't define the word men as the people of male gender. Men in that context was the impersonal pronoun meaning, humankind. But from 1700 to 1900, it was a transition period where Kali Yuga was still fighting to hold, and Dwapara Yuga was just beginning to come in. And these American revolutionaries saw it coming, and they wrote for the future. Now, of course, there was the question of slavery, there was the question of women, there was the question of indigenous people. There was fights over landowners or not landowners. All these different things were there, but the principle was perceived correctly. Then in 1900, the struggles to actually, and the Civil War, all these struggles were to really bring that Dwapara Yuga reality in. Now we're into the 20s, the aughts here. Out the 1900s have passed, we're into 2022, and the implications, the Dwapara implications of what was launched in the USA at that time is now they're fighting. It's fighting forward. And the Kali Yuga force to resist it is intensifying at the same time the determination to actually realize it, to give true equal inalienable rights to people of all races, of all nations, of all religions, of all genders, all of that. It's now coming into fruition because Dwapara is really establishing itself. So Master came, and now another aspect between Dwapara and Kali Yuga is that the various departments of life are also separated. And so the characteristic of spiritual searching, primarily during Kali Yuga, was that if you wanted to be serious about your spiritual life, you had to totally repudiate life in the world. You just simply couldn't do it. Thinking of women, you know, you were meant to be a wife, you were meant to be a mother, you were owned by your husband, and if you wanted to live a life for God, you know, caring for all those children, caring for the home, and having no rights except what were given to you by the person to whom you were married, that you couldn't have all that and also be self-determined according to God's will. So you ran off to the convent. And often the women who wanted to run off to the convent, you know, had to sneak out of their houses. You read the life of St. Clare, who was inspired by St. Francis to repudiate her wealthy life, and she just had to sneak out in the night. And then often what would happen when they would join the convent, they would cut their hair, you know, cut their hair really short. And once their hair was cut, you know, all their feminine roles were sort of symbolically and literally taken away from them at that point. Then there was respect for God and the Catholic Church, that if a woman managed to make it into the convent and commit herself to it, even the powerful men who might have been able to take her away by force were often loath to do so because now it was an offense against God. I mean, these are all the dramas that you've seen acted out if you read the lives of saints. Sometimes, of course, the families cooperated, but very often the woman had to take the matter into her own hands because it was Kali Yuga, and you just couldn't, except in rare occasions, you know, notable exceptions. St. Catherine of Siena just stayed home, but she never married. You know, sometimes, you know, a married woman found a way to still, because of her willpower, because of the cooperation of her family. And on the eastern side, and the monks, the same. The monks had to repudiate, they had to give up, they had to live very austerely. Not because it was better spiritually, but because in the time, you simply couldn't integrate it. Just the gap between worldly life and spiritual life was too great. On the Indian side, you had to go to the Himalayas. You had to leave it, because in Kali Yuga, everything is separated. Now in Dwapara Yuga, we're beginning to realize it's energy and consciousness. It's not form. And very interestingly, Master came to America, and his foremost male disciple was Rajarsi Janakananda, who was a millionaire businessman. It's like this was like such a Dwapara Yuga concept that you could be completely God-realized and be a millionaire businessman, a self-made millionaire businessman, who also had a home and had a wife. He never had children, and his wife was a little bit mentally unstable. She had become ill, and it had affected her mind. So it's not like he had this happy home life, but he did. He had a home life that he had to respect, and even his wife had an aversion to Master, so he had to keep much of his spiritual life separate. But still, it wasn't until the very end of his life that he came to live in the ashram. This was quintessential Dwapara Yuga. And his effectiveness in the world was based on his meditation. He had to meditate at his office because his wife was antagonistic. So he would go in early and he would tell his secretary they had appointments, not disturb him. He would meditate for several hours in the morning, then conduct his business after that. And he was brilliantly successful and respected by everyone. Dwapara Yuga. So Master is explaining to us that his energy and willpower and discipline, he even went so far as to make the statement that making money honestly and industriously to serve thy work. Now there's a caveat in there, not just for selfish self-aggrandizement, but to earn money and use it in a noble way, he said, is the next greatest art to the art of realizing God. I mean, that just was never said before, because making money was of the world. Money is the root of all evil. This is worldly. If you're spiritual, you live in an impoverished condition, and you prove your renunciation by the fact that you have nothing that looks anything like what worldly life looks like. Rajasi lived in a beautiful home. He had a private golf course. He liked fine things. It's just, that was the way he lived. But he was totally humble and totally without ego in any of that. So Master came, and he considered St. Francis to be his patron saint. But he said St. Francis worshipped Lady Poverty. And Master said, I'm devoted to Lady Simplicity, is how he put it. And he made his headquarters at Mount Washington, and he made it into a very attractive place for people to come. Let's see what I was thinking about it. Swamiji, at one point in the early years of Ananda, when we were quite impoverished, we didn't have to try to be poor, we simply were. And the car that Swamiji was driving at that time was a car that we had managed to obtain through our military surplus. And it cost $75, and it was this big old Chevrolet. We actually at the time bought two of them, and the mechanic kept one car to cannibalize for parts to keep the other one running. And Swamiji drove that car with some of us with him to a program that was happening in San Francisco. This would have been in the mid-70s. And as it happened, it was a gathering of many spiritual teachers from around the country, many of whom were Indian, but all of whom were living in California at that point, because we were the mecca of the new spirituality. And there was a reception being held in a very lavish home in a very posh neighborhood in San Francisco. We arrived a little late, and all the parking around the area was taken, and there were a lot of really fancy cars there. And the fancy cars, for the most part, had transported the various teachers to this event. There were Rolls Royces and a couple of Cadillacs, and it wasn't, no criticism implied to those teachers. It was just what it was. And Mercedes and whatever was fancy cars then. So Swami pulls up in this Army surplus car that you could still see faintly. You could still see the words Air Force on the side that had been painted over, but you could still see it. So of course we called this car Air Force One, which was a total joke, but that's what we called it. You know, Air Force One, that was the car. And we pulled up, and we had to sort of drive around a little because all the parking places were taken until we found a spot. And as we're walking over, Swami says, I have to get a new car. And it wasn't that he felt unworthy or intimidated. He couldn't have cared less. But it was very interesting, his comment. His comment was, in India, they would respect me for driving a car like this. They would think clearly he's a renunciate, because that's their thought, that you have to be poor. And that proves how spiritual you are. Swami said, in America, and this is the phrase, where money is so much easier to come by, if I drive a car like this and can't afford, that's the only way people would think of it, that he can't afford to get a better car, they'll think there's something wrong with my teaching. And so he went out and he bought this American-made, I think it was a Ford, but I'm not sure what it was. It was a new car. Somebody gave him the money, and it was a new car. And it was perfectly chosen because it had very classic lines. And when you looked at it, you couldn't really tell whether it was a humble car or a fancy car. And he drove that for a number of years, and it was just enough. It was because of what was being asked of him. Because Master had said, St. Francis followed poverty, I follow simplicity. And simplicity is a really wonderful word. The concept of simple living is a really marvelous word, and it took me years and years to understand this with Swami, because Swamiji just lived a much more involved, complicated life than the rest of us did. He had a larger dwelling, and he fixed the dwelling up to the limit of his funds, which were limited, but nonetheless, he put energy into making it attractive. He had equipment, he had recording equipment, he had computer equipment, and he was always willing to upgrade that equipment in order to improve what he could do, and a number of other things. But what Swami had was, he had just what he needed to do the work that he was doing. And that's what I came to understand. And now what you see on this camera is the house that I presently live in, which happens to be a very nice 3-bedroom house, which, well, there you are, okay? But this is the community house. This is many different people who have to be in our community for a period of time will stay in this house. My friends from various parts of the world at different times, or various others who, for one reason or another, need to be resident here. So it feels lavish. It even feels lavish to me. But it is actually just what I need. And Swami encouraged us to move into this house because it was the appropriate house for what we were doing. And the simplicity of it is that it's not for luxury, and it's not more than is needed, it's just what's needed. I know when Swamiji was building Crystal Hermitage and sort of decorating it and so on, he got it up to a certain point. And then he was traveling somewhere and someone saw a painting or some object of significant force and said, oh, that would be so lovely in Crystal Hermitage. And Swami said, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life decorating Crystal Hermitage. He said, it's fine just the way it is. And that's what I realized. He brought it up to the level it needed, as he put it, in America especially. If you don't create an atmosphere that has a certain refinement to it, people will think that your ideas are not refined. And he had to tell us we had to bring all of Ananda up to a certain level of simple refinement so that people would understand the vibration that we were offering them. And this is what Master was bringing us in the teachings of self-realization, which is that we apply it to all areas of life. And Master started that. He gave principles of success and how to have a happy marriage and principles of prosperity, principles of physical health. Whereas the Kali Yuga idea was that you tortured the body and let it collapse on you. The original sannyas ideas from Kali Yuga was that a sannyasi never handled money. What to speak of accumulated or had a bank account or, ran an organization or something like that. He never touched money. But, and you never stayed more than 3 days in one place. You had no fixed dwelling. All of those things were appropriate for Kali Yuga because you had to strongly separate yourself. But if it's only energy, then it's all a matter of consciousness. So Master just set an example which Swami followed, and then Swamiji's job was to draw out from the seminal writings of Master and through his attunement, how does it really apply to money? How does it really apply to health? And this little booklet that we're working from with these 52 qualities, it covers a lot of these. One of the 52 qualities is income. Like how do we take a Dwapara spiritual approach to income? So we're starting right here with success. And here Swami just immediately takes it. Outward success means transcendence also. And you think, well, how can you be outwardly successful if you're transcending it? Like, if you were transcending it, why would you care? That's the way the mind would think. But then you have Rajasi, who was a self-realized master, who made money, creating innovative business ideas and acting them out and having a big company and, employing all these people. That doesn't match your mind of transcendence, but here's how he explains it. It means rising above past accomplishments to reach new levels of achievement. Isn't that exactly right? That's where success comes from. If we just sit and allow things to be as they always were, the real successes in this world, whether they're admirable people, whether they have spiritual ideals or not, they're always looking to see what the next step is. Steve Jobs is an extremely interesting example because he was the founder of Apple Computer and basically, to a very large extent, created the lifestyle that we have here with his ideas of the individual computer. Then it went on to the iPhone, which led, first he had, and I can't even remember, when the music was separate from the phone. And all of a sudden music was digital and you could keep your whole record collection in your pocket. You could listen to it at any time. Then he started with the personal telephone, and then he put all the features of life into the telephone, all of which we just take for granted now. There's already generations of grown-ups who never knew another reality than this. He made it up. He made it all up. He was closely aligned to Parmhansa Yogananda, interestingly. Very, very interestingly. He was devoted to Yogananda in his way. And it was, Steve Jobs brought in Dwapara Yuga. And interestingly, he was just always pushing for the next reality. He was always ahead. Even when at one point people suggested he do market research to find out sort of what people wanted, what products did they want. His answer was, they don't know what they want. I haven't invented it yet. And there may have been an element of arrogance to that. It's irrelevant. But he was telling the truth. Success is transcendence. This is what people know they want, but we're going to go past what we've already accomplished and offer them something they didn't even know was there. And so all of us who, especially those of us who are working inspired by this teaching, by these masters, whatever field you're working in, whether it's education or being raising children or technology or space travel or retail sales, whatever it is, you have to be looking at where I am right now, but not as the end point, because real success has to be measured in terms of expansion. There's always two directions that we live in life. We either contract or we expand. And that doesn't mean you have to get bigger and richer and, franchise your brand all over the world. It's not like that. But you have to, on some level, accomplish more than you accomplished yesterday. Because otherwise, if we don't keep expanding, we stagnate, and then we gradually become smaller. And this is what you see all around you. That people reach a certain level, and then they just hunker down to be comfortable there. But can you call that success if we stop growing when our potential is infinite? If we content ourselves with less than we're capable of doing? Now, our way of expressing it may shift. The fourth ashram of life is not the same as when you're in your 20s. There's a certain need that you have in the first decades of your life that the quality of it shifts. But nonetheless, we're still trying to accomplish, to transcend, to go beyond what we already know. Because that's what life is for, is to more and better. As Sister Gyanamata put it, if you had it all to do over again, what would you do? I would do everything I did, but I would do it more and better. Isn't that a lovely way to think about it? So let us think about our success that way, more and better. God bless you.